upholding scientific research and discovery in respect, as we should, we must also be alert to the equal and opposite danger that public policy could itself become the captive of a scientific, technological elite.
We've signed a climate convention on the importance of economic instruments and free markets. Were included in this mammoth Agenda 21 document and the Rio Declaration. Now, let me be clear on one fundamental point. The United States fully intends to be the world's preeminent leader in protecting the global environment.
Coming up, Technocracy News. And greetings from Technocracy News and Trends. Patrick Wood here, Editor-in-Chief, and today we're going to talk about human rights and nature's rights. The headline of the first story is titled, Nature's Rights Movement Will Destroy the Concept of Private Property, not only in America, but around the world, I might add. And I wrote at the top of this story, this new legal precedent could completely reshape city, county, and state permitting and zoning decisions as it decouples private property rights of humans by giving similar rights to nature. And you might say, well, what's wrong with that? Doesn't nature have rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Well, some people think that it should. And this article states, when the members of the White Earth Band of Ojibwe in Minnesota take out their canoes to harvest wild rice, they're gathering a source of nutriment and following a tradition that has connected them to the land for generations. But to the White Earth people, Manuman isn't just a resource to be used. It's an independent entity with the right, quote, to exist, flourish, regenerate, and evolve. Other tribes and even some cities are also embracing the idea that Mother Nature has legal rights, setting the stage for court battles that could shake governments, businesses, and the environmental movement. Earlier this year, voters in Toledo, Ohio, passed the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, which declared, quote, irrevocable rights for Lake Erie ecosystem to exist, flourish, and naturally evolve, close quote. The measure would give the ecosystem legal standing, which means that the lake, with help from a human guardian, could enter the court system as a plaintiff and sue polluters. That's right. The lake itself could sue its polluters. The article continues, recognizing rights of nature as the concept is known also would shape city and state permitting and planning decisions, and it might become a powerful tool in fighting climate change and habit loss, but is still uncertain if any of the forms the movement has taken, protecting specific watersheds, habitats, and species, will prove most effective as a legal tactic. And critics in business and government contend that overly broad declarations could paralyze important development and infrastructure if entire habitats are rendered untouchable. Our legal system gives corporations rights, but treats nature as property that can be exploited, said Tish Odell, Ohio organizer with the Community Environmental Legal Defense Fund, which helped back the ballot measure. If we don't have the right to clean air and clean water in the Constitution, that was because our founding fathers couldn't even fathom that would be something you'd need to write in. But the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, one of a handful of such measures enacted across the country, is being challenged in court. Drewry's Farm Partnership, an Ohio business, asserts the measure is unconstitutional and would harm agriculture and other interests in the region. That challenge is currently awaiting a ruling from the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Ohio. Some state attorneys general, agricultural interest, and business groups say recognizing rights of nature would make businesses and governments vulnerable to lawsuits over almost any action with an impact on the environment. Thomas Fusini, a lawyer representing one of the plaintiffs in the Lake Erie lawsuit, said the Toledo measure would allow any city resident to sue any business or government within the watershed for really undefined potential violations. Fusini said, quote, "When you're talking about the right for soil or mosquitoes to naturally evolve, people are going to have different views on what might violate that. You can't do anything to the land. You can't farm it. You can't put new roads in. You can't do landscaping." Several U.S. tribes already have enacted rights of nature laws, pointing out that indigenous people have long treated nature as a shared resource that must be preserved. A councilwoman of the Ponca Nation in Oklahoma and a leader of the Rights of Nature movement said, quote, "These are the natural laws that have always existed prior to the poisoning of the land by the extractive industry. If you eat, if you breathe, if you drink water, then it's an undeniable connection between human and nature." In 2017, the Ponca Nation became one of the first tribes in the country to enact a Rights of Nature law, an anti-fracking measure aimed at protecting the tribe from an increasing number of earthquakes and rising cancer and asthma rates. Soon after, the White Earth Band of Ojibwe enacted its own law recognizing the rights of wild rice, as well as its freshwater resources and habitats. The tribe signed a treaty with the federal government in 1837, granting it access to wild rice on ceded territory. But that treaty means nothing if there is no wild rice left to be harvested, said tribal attorney Frank Babu. Wild rice has a right to exist. It has a right to flourish, he said. We have a right to defend it and protect it. For the tribe, harvesting wild rice is not just a matter of economic or nutritional importance, but a continuation of cultural and spiritual practices. It also carries strategic value, as the tribe's treaty guarantees continued access to the resource, and protecting the rice means protecting the water on which it grows. Wild rice is the most important cultural aspect of our livelihood, he said. Our migration path took us here, to the Great Lakes, where the food grows on the water. If we can't protect the water, then we're probably protecting everything else. The White Earth Band is hopeful that it can use the law to block future threats to the resource, such as oil pipelines and mines. But like many other aspects of tribal law, questions of jurisdiction remain a challenge. Now, this article goes on. It's stranger than fiction in many ways. The rights of wild rice may be more important than human rights, and in any case, if this theory spreads to other aspects of the environment around our country, much less the world, then the whole concept of property rights is thrown up in the air in a sense like a game of 52-card pickup. You simply won't be able to survive in court if you receive a summons that you are being sued by a field of wild rice. How do you defend against that? Answer, you can't. And if you're a farmer or a rancher who has a proprietary interest in the land that he farms or ranches, is sued by the various elements of that land, he won't stand a chance to maintain his property rights as we have traditionally known them. And I want to point out that when Agenda 21 was first created in 1992, one of the primary initiatives was to destroy property rights, where property was held, managed, and conserved by its owners, not by some global common group, but by the people who own it. And indeed, private property is part and parcel of our U.S. Constitution, which states very clearly that all Americans have unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and to the ownership of private property. Our next story has to do with a new financial instrument known as green bonds. Green bonds. You know, bonds are those things that banks sell and governments sell that must be repaid in time, but they sell them en masse to the public and to investment firms and banks who hold them and hopefully get interest from the income distribution from the bonds. But now, this new concept of green bonds has emerged and has become a vehicle for virtue signaling. Wow, if you invest in green bonds, you must be cool. You must be fighting for the environment. I wrote at the top of this article, green bonds are increasingly popular instruments to finance sustainable development, green economy, and Green New Deal, a.k.a. technocracy, by the way. But wrongly diverted money only causes greater economic dislocation. Someday I ought to give a treatise on what economic dislocation is, but it has to do with the misplaced capital that gets invested into assets that cannot or will not produce the desired result of the original purpose of the capital in the first place. In the case of green bonds, you just have to read this article to understand what they're trying to do. It states, while still small, sustainable financing is growing. There's been $165 billion of so-called green bond issuance from countries and companies this year, more than double 2016's total, according to data compiled by Bloomberg. And under pressure from the people demanding policymakers do something to save the world from almost certain climate-driven doom. Bloomberg reports that central banks are putting their money-printing malarkey to work in sustainable financing, opening up a new source of demand for the budding asset class. Most central banks have signed on to promote sustainable growth, offering incentives that encourage green financing. Quote, central banks are important institutional investors, and the fact that they are participating in this market, it gives the market almost like a seal of reliability and maturity, said Christian Desinglis, global head of central banks and global sponsor of sustainable finance at HSBC Holdings, the biggest underwriter of the bonds this year. It's not so much about adding demand, because we already have demand, he said. It's the quality of that demand that's really important. The European Central Bank has been buying the debt as part of its asset repurchase program. Hungary and France's central banks have each created funds dedicated to ecological investments. Now, Peru is considering buying green bonds too. While the Federal Reserve, with nearly $4 trillion on its balance sheet, is notably absent from the network for greening the financial system, regional branches have published research on the topic, and Chairman Jerome Powell maintains that it's a longer-run issue. However, as Bloomberg notes, pricing and liquidity are still limiting factors. As green bonds become more mainstream, investors are offered little additional incentive to buy them as they price comparably to non-green debt. Quote, as soon as the green bond market becomes sizable, you'll see central banks investing in more green bonds. According to one analyst, the head of sovereign strategy at UBS Asset Management. Of course, as most are aware, green bonds are largely a marketing gimmick. And if central banks really do escalate their buying, then you don't need a crystal ball to forecast that there will be a rise in companies greenwashing their issuance, using green labels to spend on not-so-green things. Nevertheless, the San Francisco Fed is quick to explain the benefits of these new green bonds. And here's what they say. The Forest Resilient Bond, the FRB, is a financial tool that enables private investment in forest enhancements on public land. The FRB promises to accelerate the pace and scale at which critical work to restore the health and functioning of the nation's forested landscapes is undertaken. It does so by engaging private capital to cover the upfront cost of activities to improve forest health, and by bringing together stakeholders that benefit from this work to share in the cost of reimbursing investors over time. These beneficiaries sign contracts that jointly cover the project cost plus a modest return to investors, meaning that no one stakeholder shoulders the burden of repayment alone. The result is a collaborative finance model that yields clear ecological, social, and financial returns. The bank continues, while perhaps less obvious, the FRB model also unlocks opportunities for positive social impact in rural communities across the country. In addition to the direct impact of job creation, FRB projects can catalyze infusions of capital into rural areas by sending signals to the market that there is a steady supply of raw material to fuel forest-based industries. Against a backdrop of declining rural prosperity, this article envisions how FRB could play a role in assisting rural areas, especially those with historically forest-based economies, transition to a more resilient ecological and economic future. To put it another way, the article continues, it's a public-private partnership that levers taxpayer funds to support green-led initiatives without the need for voting, because the central banks are unelected. So to summarize, the concept of green bonds is becoming more and more mainstream. Who cares if we don't get any yield? At least we are signaling just how virtuous we are. And as various wealthy Western nations hit the monetary and fiscal policy wall, the rhetoric around people's QE, or a modern monetary theory-driven or MMT redistribution, spreads positively among many, especially the socialism-supporting millennials. This is an incredible development. Green bonds that people are buying not to receive a return necessarily, although they hope for one, but they're purchasing these things to signal how virtuous they are and how committed they are to save the world, save the planet from global warming. That is, the global warming that Technocracy News readers understand is a myth. Our third story today is equally interesting and follows up on another story that was run a few years ago that had to do with Berkeley, California. Berkeley banned natural gas from its city. Of course, not for the corporations that have businesses there, but for all the homeowners, new construction cannot be built with any hookup to natural gas. So scratch that option. Well, one of the largest cities in the country, and certainly one of the largest in the Bay Area, San Jose, California, has decided it too will ban natural gas. The article states San Jose Mayor Sam Liccardo and other city council members approved a proposal to prohibit natural gas infrastructure from being installed in many new residential buildings. The measure covers single-family homes, accessory dwelling units, and low-rise multifamily buildings. Now, I want to note here, they're following the lead in Berkeley. The only people who are being denied natural gas are the citizens of those cities. They're the ones who will bear the punishment of not being able to use a cheap energy resource like natural gas. Office buildings, other commercial entities will be free to continue using natural gas, but not homeowners. You want to buy a single-family home? No natural gas for you. The article continues, the ordinance would require all new multifamily buildings to have 70% electric-capable parking spaces, at least 20% EV-ready spaces, and at least 10% EV supply equipment spaces. A final ordinance is expected to be approved in October, going into effect on January 1. The council's intention is to expand the ban to include more buildings, and it has requested check-ins from city staff over the next several months with recommendations for the expansion, a mayor's office spokesman told Smart Cities Dive. They are also examining offsetting the cost of solar and battery storage installations in affordable housing. San Jose's ban comes just after Berkeley, California, passed a natural gas ban that will also take effect on January 1. San Jose is the largest city to advance this type of ordinance. It aims to reduce emissions from buildings, which are considered the largest emissions producers, along with transportation. Other U.S. cities also are pushing for greater building electrification to get away from fossil fuel use. Seattle Mayor Jenny Durkin proposed a tax on heating oil providers to help 3,000 homes transition from oil to electric heat. This spring, San Francisco Mayor London Breed proposed a plan to transition buildings over 50,000 square feet to 100% renewable energy by 2030. That occurred just after Chicago became the largest U.S. city to commit to 100% renewable energy by 2035. A number of climate and environmental advocacy groups, including the Sierra Club, are in favor of San Jose's move. And of course, you would expect that from the Sierra Club. I wrote at the top of this article, and we'll close with this. The ultra-left environmental group, Sierra Club, claims that 50 other California cities are also considering a ban on natural gas, the cleanest, cheapest, and most resilient source of energy on planet Earth. So far, San Jose is the largest city in the U.S. to ban natural gas. The only byproducts of burning natural gas are water and CO2, which is used by plants, of course, to generate oxygen. There are enough proven reserves currently in production that could power the entire United States for at least 80 years, and more reserves are being discovered every year. New scientific discoveries have also demonstrated that hydrocarbon fuels are continuously regenerated within the earth. The object of sustainable development, aka technocracy, is to create artificial shortages in critical resources that subsequently demand limited allocation. Of course, the managers of these resources will be the United Nations and the NGOs associated with it, and not citizens or private companies like you and I. I'm Patrick Wood for Technocracy News and Trends. We'll see you next time.